I'm 88 years old, and I want to start by asking you something that most people never stop to consider. What if the most important truth about your life was hidden from you for decades, and you only discovered it when it was almost too late? I know that sounds dramatic. Believe me, if someone had said that to me a few years ago, I probably would have laughed it off, poured myself another cup of weak coffee, and turned up the radio like I always did. For most of my life, I thought my story was simple, ordinary, the kind of American life you don't write books about. I grew up believing I knew who I was, where I came from, and why my life turned out the way it did. I never questioned it. Back in my day, you didn't question family, you didn't question the past, you just kept moving forward. I was raised in a time when silence was considered respect. I grew up hearing phrases like, "That's none of your business," or "Some things are better left alone," and I believed that. I carried that belief through the decades, through marriage, through work, through raising children, through burying people I loved. I thought I understood my place in this world. I thought the 1970s were just another chapter in a long life. Nothing more than noisy years filled with gas lines, old AM radio, bell bottoms, and the steady hum of a country trying to find itself after Vietnam and Watergate. But now, looking back from this age, I realize something unsettling. Those years weren't just background noise. The 1970s weren't just a phase America went through. They were the moment my entire life quietly changed direction, without me ever knowing why. There was always a feeling I couldn't name, a sense that something didn't line up. I remember moments where I felt out of place in my own family, like I was playing a role written by someone else. But I brushed it off. Everyone did back then. You didn't talk about feelings. You worked, you paid bills, you showed up. That's what being an adult meant in the United States at that time, especially if you came from a modest home like mine. As the years passed, that feeling faded into the background, drowned out by routine. Life has a way of doing that. It keeps you busy, so you don't ask dangerous questions. And for a long time, I was grateful for that. I thought not knowing was the same as being safe. Then one ordinary day, not dramatic, not planned, something from the past resurfaced. Something small, something forgotten. And with it came a realization that hit harder than anything I had experienced before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't shock. It was a quiet, bone-deep understanding that the story I'd been living wasn't the full story at all. What I uncovered traced straight back to the 1970s, two choices made without my consent. Two secrets wrapped in good intentions, to a version of protection that reshaped my entire identity. Suddenly, memories I thought were meaningless started to make sense. Conversations, looks, long pauses at the dinner table. Everything connected. At 88, time feels different. You don't have the luxury of pretending anymore. You start looking backward, not to relive life, but to finally understand it. And that's what I'm doing now, because some truths don't expire. They wait. So let me ask you this. How well do you really know the story of your own life? And what if the decade you barely think about anymore holds the answer to who you truly are? Before I go any further, I want to pause here for a moment, because this part matters more than you might think. If this story is making you reflect, if it's stirring memories or questions about your own family, I'd really like to hear from you. Take a second and leave a comment below. Even something simple like "I'm listening" or "This feels familiar" lets me know you're truly here with me. Understanding this kind of story isn't passive. It asks you to think, to connect dots, to look at your own past with honest eyes. And if you feel that connection, please tap the like button. It tells the platform this kind of real, human story deserves to be shared. If you haven't subscribed yet, consider doing that now. This channel is about forgotten decades, hidden truths, and the moments we only understand later in life. Stay with me, because what comes next goes even deeper into the truth I uncovered. I remember the exact moment when everything finally came into focus, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because of how ordinary it felt. It was one of those quiet days that come more often when you reach my age. The house was still, the clock on the wall sounded louder than it ever had. I was sitting alone, surrounded by objects I'd owned for decades, things that had survived moves, losses, celebrations, and long stretches of routine. And yet, in that stillness, I felt something shift. Not outside of me, but inside. A realization so heavy and so calm at the same time that I had to sit there and breathe through it. At 88 years old, your relationship with time changes. You stop rushing. You stop pretending that tomorrow will always be there to fix what today avoids. You begin to notice patterns. Not just in the world, but in your own life. I started replaying moments I had long dismissed as insignificant. Small comments made by relatives, awkward silences that fell over a room whenever certain topics came up. The way my questions were redirected when I was younger, especially during the 1970s, a decade everyone remembers for big cultural shifts. But not for the quiet, personal decisions that happened behind closed doors. Back then, I was too busy living to analyze anything. The 1970s were noisy on the surface, but emotionally, many American households were built on silence. We didn't talk about uncomfortable truths. We didn't unpack family history. We didn't challenge narratives handed down to us by parents who believed they were doing the right thing, and I was no different. I accepted my life as it was presented to me. I worked hard. I showed up. I played my role. That's what you did if you wanted to survive and belong. But as I sat there that day, something kept pulling at me, a feeling that the life I had lived so confidently was missing a crucial page, not a footnote, a full chapter. And the strangest part was realizing that this chapter wasn't lost to time. It had been deliberately tucked away, protected, hidden, not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of judgment, fear of shame, fear rooted deeply in the social rules of mid-century America. Rules that followed families well into the 1970s. I began to see how decisions made decades ago had quietly shaped my path. Why certain opportunities never came my way. Why certain relationships felt strained without explanation. Why I always carried a sense of being slightly out of sync, like I arrived at my own life a few steps too late. These weren't random coincidences. They were consequences. Consequences of a truth I had never been allowed to see. What struck me most wasn't anger. People often assume that discovering something this late in life must come with rage or bitterness. But that wasn't it. It was clarity. A sharp, almost unsettling clarity that forced me to reevaluate everything I thought I knew about myself, my identity, my place in my family, my role in the story I had been telling myself for nearly 9 decades. The 1970s stopped being just a decade in American history and became the turning point of my entire existence. I realized that while the country was changing publicly through music, politics, and social movements, my life was being redirected privately. Quiet conversations happened without me. Choices were made on my behalf. And once those choices were locked in, the truth was sealed away, never meant to resurface. At least, not while it still mattered in the way people usually define that word. There's a strange loneliness that comes with understanding your life this deeply, this late. You don't have the energy to confront everyone. Some of them are gone. Some of them wouldn't remember it the same way. And some of them would still insist they did what was best. Maybe they did, but intent doesn't erase impact. And impact lingers, especially when you finally see it for what it is. As I pieced things together, memories began to rearrange themselves. Events I once remembered as neutral took on new meaning. The way someone avoided eye contact, the tension in a room that a child could feel but not name. I started to understand that my confusion all those years ago wasn't immaturity. It was intuition. I sensed something was wrong, but I was never given the language to describe it. Now, at this stage of life, understanding feels more important than resolution. I don't need apologies. I don't need explanations rehearsed decades too late. What I needed and what I finally found was the truth. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. It settles into you, changing the way you view your past, your present, and the little time you know you still have. If you're still with me right now, I want to know something. Have you ever felt like parts of your own life didn't quite add up? Like there was a missing piece you were never allowed to touch? If that resonates, take a moment at the end and leave a comment with a word like clarity or truth, or even just I relate. Reading those tells me I'm not alone in the sand, neither are you. Growing up in post-war America felt, at the time, like living inside a promise that no one ever explained out loud. I was born into a country that believed it had survived something terrible and come out stronger, and that belief hung in the air everywhere you went. You could feel it in the way adults spoke about the future, in the pride behind everyday routines, in the quiet determination that settled over households like mine. We didn't have much, but we had structure, and structure was everything. It told you who you were supposed to be before you were old enough to ask. My childhood memories are filled with ordinary scenes that now feel almost cinematic in hindsight. Small houses lined up on neat streets, front porches where neighbors waved without needing an invitation, kitchens that smelled like coffee early in the morning and dinner by late afternoon. Fathers left for work at the same hour every day, lunch pails in hand, and mothers kept the world running in quieter ways that were rarely acknowledged. Sunday mornings meant church clothes and careful behavior. Weeknights meant homework at the table and the radio humming in the background. That was post-war America, as I knew it, predictable, disciplined, and deeply committed to the idea that stability was the highest form of success. There wasn't much room for questions in that environment. Curiosity existed, of course, but it was guided, sometimes steered away from topics that made adults uncomfortable. You learned early which subjects caused a pause in conversation, which ones made voices drop slightly. Family history was treated like a closed book. You were told what you needed to know and nothing more. And because everyone around you lived the same way, it felt normal. That kind of silence becomes invisible when it's all you've ever known. School reinforced the same message. We were taught to respect authority, to follow instructions, to believe that hard work would naturally lead to a good life. Teachers didn't encourage us to dig too deeply into personal matters. Education was about facts, not feelings, about dates and names, not the messy details that made people human. And I absorbed all of it. I learned how to fit in, how to keep my head down, how to measure my worth by how well I followed the rules laid out before me. Looking back now, I realize how much of my identity was shaped during those early years, without my awareness. Post-war America prized conformity, even if no one used that word. Standing out wasn't encouraged. Blending in was survival. And for a long time, I thought I was doing just fine. I never suspected that the foundation I was standing on had cracks in it, cracks that would widen decades later when I finally looked back with honest eyes. As I moved into adolescence, the world began to change, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, the optimism of the post-war years started to share space with uncertainty. Still, inside my home, things stayed the same. The rules didn't shift just because the country was evolving. Family expectations remained fixed. Roles were clearly defined, and deviating from them wasn't just frowned upon, was quietly corrected. I learned how to adjust myself, how to mold my thoughts into something more acceptable, how to silence instincts that didn't align with what was expected of me. What stands out to me now is how much trust I placed in the adults around me. In that era, adults were assumed to know best, always. Their decisions were rarely questioned, especially by children. If something didn't make sense, you assumed the problem was you. That mindset stayed with me far longer than it should have. It followed me into adulthood, into the 1970s, into moments when I felt unease but didn't know how to challenge it. Post-war America taught me how to endure, how to carry on without complaint. It taught me resilience, yes, but it also taught me to accept explanations without evidence, to accept stories without context, to accept identities without understanding where they truly came from. And at the time, that felt like safety. Structure feels safe when you don't know what it's protecting you from. The older I got, the more I realized that many people from my generation carried similar experiences. We grew up surrounded by unspoken rules, by emotional restraint, by an almost sacred respect for privacy that often crossed into secrecy. It wasn't malicious, it was cultural. It was how people coped after surviving war, loss, and economic hardship. They believed silence was strength. They believed shielding children from difficult truths was an act of love. But love, when filtered through fear, can leave long shadows. As I reflect on those early years now, I see how they set the stage for everything that came later. The decisions made in my childhood home didn't just influence my behavior. They shaped my perception of reality. They prepared me to accept the unexplained. They trained me not to dig too deeply. And when the 1970s arrived, with all their upheaval and contradiction, I wasn't equipped to question the personal changes unfolding quietly in my own life. Post-war America gave me stability, but it also gave me blind spots. And those blind spots mattered more than I could have ever imagined at the time. They allowed certain truths to remain hidden, tucked away beneath layers of routine and respectability. Truths that would wait patiently for decades until I was finally old enough, and perhaps brave enough, to recognize them. If any of this feels familiar to you, I'd like you to remember that you're not alone. Many of us were shaped by the same era, the same values, the same unspoken rules. And if you've ever felt like your upbringing left questions unanswered, leave a comment at the end with a word like family, silence, or I understand. Those words help keep this conversation going, and they tell me that these memories still matter to you as much as they do to me. For most of my life, I thought I knew exactly who I was. Not in a dramatic, soul-searching way, but in the practical sense that mattered in America for people of my generation. I had a name, a family role, a job history, a reputation. I knew where I fit in conversations, at holiday tables, in photographs that ended up in albums no one opened very often. I believed identity was something stable, something you earned over time by being consistent, reliable, and quiet when necessary. And for decades, that belief never failed, me or so I thought. I saw myself as ordinary, and I meant that in a good way. I wasn't chasing greatness or recognition. I took pride in being dependable. I showed up on time. I paid my bills. I stayed loyal. I believed that character was built through repetition, through doing the same right things over and over until they became invisible. That's how I defined myself. That's how I explained my life when people asked about it. Simple, solid, uncomplicated. When I looked in the mirror in my younger years, I didn't see mystery. I saw continuity. I thought my life followed a straight line that began in post-war America, moved steadily through adulthood, and settled into stability. I believed my choices were my own, shaped by values passed down to me honestly and fully. I never questioned whether those values were based on the whole truth or just the part I was allowed to see. I thought I was someone who understood their past. I could tell you where I grew up, what my parents were like, what kind of household I came from. I could list the defining moments the way people do when they believe those moments explain everything: school, first job, marriage, children, loss, routine. I told myself that these milestones were enough to define a person, that you didn't need to look beneath them, but there were cracks I learned to ignore, moments that didn't fit neatly into the story I told myself. Times when I felt like an observer in my own life instead of a participant. I remember sitting in rooms where everyone seemed to share an unspoken understanding that I wasn't fully part of. I remember feeling slightly disconnected, as if I was always catching up to something everyone else already knew. I told myself it was insecurity, or imagination, or simply the human condition. I thought I was someone who didn't dwell on the past. I wore that as a badge of honor. Dwelling was seen as weakness where I came from. You moved forward, you adapted, you didn't linger on questions that had no clear answers. So when doubts surfaced, I pushed them aside. I convinced myself that contentment came from acceptance, not curiosity. And for a long time, that strategy worked well enough. As the years went by, my sense of self became more fixed. People around me described me using the same words over and over: steady, reserved, dependable. I accepted those descriptions without resistance. They felt accurate, they felt earned. I didn't see myself as someone with hidden depths or unresolved identity questions. I thought those struggles belonged to younger generations, to people with too much time to think and not enough responsibility to ground them. In the 1970s, when the world seemed to be questioning everything, politics, culture, authority remained personally unchanged, at least on the surface. I watched the shifts happen around me, but I didn't apply that questioning inward. I assumed that whatever I was, I had already become it. My identity felt finished, settled, like a house fully built and lived in. What I didn't realize then was that my certainty depended on omission. My confidence rested on a version of my story that was incomplete. I believed I understood myself because I had never been given a reason to think otherwise. No one challenged the narrative. No one offered alternative explanations. And because of that, I never thought to ask. Looking back now, I see how much effort went into maintaining that version of me, not just from others, but from myself. I actively participated in preserving the image of who I thought I was. I avoided questions that might disrupt it. I dismissed feelings that didn't align with it. I adjusted memories to fit it. That's what survival looks like when you don't know you're surviving something. I thought I was defined by my actions, but I didn't consider how much those actions were shaped by decisions made long before I had a say. I thought I was choosing my path, when in reality, my options had already been narrowed quietly, carefully, and intentionally. That realization didn't come with fireworks. It came slowly, like fog lifting to reveal a landscape you've been walking through blindly. The hardest part wasn't learning that I had misunderstood my past. It was realizing how comfortable I had been not knowing, how easily I accepted explanations that required no deeper inspection, how willingly I embraced an identity that felt safe rather than true. I don't say that with shame. I say it with honesty. Because many of us did the same thing. We were taught to now. When I think about who I thought I was, I don't see foolishness. I see a person doing the best they could with the information they had. I see someone shaped by their time, their culture, their family's silences. I see a version of myself that made sense in context, even if that context was incomplete. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all that. You can live an entire life believing you know yourself, only to discover later that your identity was built on carefully managed gaps. Not lies, necessarily, just missing truths. If this part of my story resonates with you, I want you to hold on to that feeling. And at the very end, if you feel inclined, leave a comment with a phrase like, "I thought I knew," or "This feels familiar." Those words help me understand how many of us are walking similar paths, quietly questioning who we believed ourselves to be. By the time the 1970s arrived, I believed my life was already set on a clear path. I wasn't young anymore, but I wasn't old either. I was in that in-between space where routine feels permanent and change feels unlikely. America itself seemed restless during that decade, but inside my own world, things appeared stable. I had responsibilities, habits, and a sense of direction that felt earned. I thought whatever mattered most had already happened, and whatever came next would simply follow the pattern already in place. On the surface, the 1970s were loud and chaotic. You could feel the tension everywhere. People talked about the country like it was losing its footing. There was uncertainty in the air, a sense that the rules everyone grew up with were starting to bend or break. Music changed, conversations changed, trust in institutions faded. But in many homes, including mine, there was an unspoken agreement to keep personal matters separate from the noise outside. The world might have been questioning everything, but families like mine stayed quiet, guarded, careful. I remember how normal those years felt to me at the time. I woke up, went to work, came home tired, and repeated the process the next day. Life didn't feel dramatic. It felt practical. That's what makes it so difficult to explain now, looking back. Nothing exploded. Nothing collapsed. Instead, something subtle shifted beneath my feet while I wasn't paying attention. And that subtle shift changed everything that followed. There were decisions made during those years that I didn't fully understand at the time. Decisions that were presented to me as necessary, sensible, and final. I accepted them without resistance because that's what I had been trained to do. I trusted the people around me. I trusted their judgment more than my own instincts. And if something felt off, I told myself it was just the stress of the times, the pressure everyone was under in that decade. The strange thing about the 1970s is how easily personal history can hide inside public history. When people talk about that era now, they focus on the headlines, the politics, the cultural shifts, but behind closed doors, quieter stories were unfolding. Family secrets were being protected. Reputations were being preserved. Choices were being justified as temporary, even when their consequences were permanent. I didn't see that then. I was too close to it. I was living inside it. I noticed changes in how people spoke to me, but I didn't question them. A certain distance crept into conversations that used to feel open. There were moments when I sensed hesitation, like words were being carefully chosen around me. I assumed it was adulthood, that natural drift people talk about. I didn't consider that something specific might be influencing that shift. I didn't consider that information was being withheld intentionally out of fear of what the truth might disrupt. Looking back now, I see how the 1970s quietly redirected my life. Opportunities that might have existed before suddenly disappeared. Paths I thought I was walking confidently began to narrow without explanation. I adjusted without protest, telling myself that flexibility was maturity, that adapting was wisdom. I didn't realize I was adapting to a reality shaped by facts I didn't have access to. What makes this realization so unsettling is how reasonable everything seemed at the time. Nothing felt suspicious. The explanations I was given made sense within the context of that era. Privacy was valued. Image mattered. Certain topics were considered dangerous, not because they were false, but because they threatened stability. Families believed they were doing the right thing by keeping difficult truths buried. And I believed them. The 1970s were also the years when I stopped asking questions altogether. I didn't consciously decide to stop. It just happened. Life demanded attention elsewhere. Work, responsibilities, obligations, all of it filled the space where curiosity might have lived. And once questions stop forming, answers stop being sought. That's how decades can pass without clarity, even when the truth is sitting quietly in the background. I sometimes wonder how different my life might have felt if I had known then what I know now. Not because I would have made different choices necessarily, but because I would have understood the weight of the ones I was making. Understanding doesn't always change outcomes, but it changes how you carry them. And during the 1970s, I carried a lot without understanding why it felt heavier than it should. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from sensing change without being able to name it. You feel disconnected, but you can't explain it to anyone. You assume the problem is internal, that you're ungrateful, or restless, or simply overthinking, so you stay quiet. And the silence grows comfortable, even as it quietly shapes your identity. Now, decades later, I can see the 1970s not as a chaotic chapter, but as the hinge on which my entire life turned. Not with noise, not with drama, but with quiet decisions made out of love, fear, and social pressure. Decisions that were never revisited. Decisions that followed me long after that decade ended. The most unsettling part is realizing how easily a life can be redirected without resistance when trust is involved. When you believe the people around you have your best interests at heart, you don't look for hidden motives. You don't imagine missing information. You assume the story you're living is complete. And in the 1970s, I had no reason to believe otherwise. If you're still listening right now, I want to ask you something gently. Have you ever looked back at a specific decade in your life and felt like it carried more weight than you understood at the time? If so, when this part ends, leave a comment with a word like 1970s, turning point, or even quiet change. Those words tell me this story isn't just mine and that these silent moments matter more than we realize. The hardest truth to accept wasn't the secret itself, but the realization that I was the only one who didn't know it. That knowledge settled in slowly, like a chill you don't notice until you stop moving. Once I allowed myself to see it, I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. They had always been there, woven into everyday moments, so naturally that I mistook them for coincidence or personality. But they weren't. They were evidence of a shared understanding that existed around me, an understanding I was never meant to be part of. I began replaying old scenes in my mind with new awareness. Family gatherings where conversations shifted the moment I entered the room. Long pauses that felt heavier than words. Looks exchanged across tables that I never quite understood. At the time, I assumed it was nothing. People have moods. Families are complicated. That's what I told myself. But now I can see that those moments were coordinated in a quiet, almost respectful way. Everyone knew when to stop talking. Everyone knew what not to say. Except me. There's something deeply unsettling about realizing you were the subject of a secret rather than its keeper. I wasn't excluded because I was unimportant. I was excluded because the truth involved me. And in the logic of that time, that made silence feel justified. They believed they were protecting me, protecting my sense of stability, protecting the life they thought I needed to have. In doing so, they created an invisible wall that followed me for decades. I remember specific instances that only make sense now. Questions I asked that were answered vaguely or redirected entirely. Stories that never quite lined up. Details that changed depending on who was speaking. I didn't push for clarity because I trusted the people around me. Trust was everything in the world I grew up in. If someone older told you something, you accepted it. You didn't interrogate it. You didn't suspect omission. You believed the version you were given was complete. The truth is, everyone else adjusted their behavior around the secret. They learned how to carry it without letting it slip. They learned which words were safe and which ones weren't. Over time, that kind of shared silence becomes automatic. It turns into habit. It becomes part of the family's emotional architecture. And the longer it exists, the more normal it feels to the people inside it. What hurts most now isn't the fact that the secret existed, but how carefully my life was shaped around it. Decisions were influenced, opportunities were filtered, expectations were quietly modified, all without my knowledge. I wasn't lied to outright. I was guided away from the truth so gently that I never realized I was being guided at all. That's a powerful thing, shaping a life through omission rather than deception. I think back to the 1970s, to how easily people justified silence back then. Society rewarded discretion. Privacy was considered a virtue. Airing uncomfortable truths was seen as selfish or destructive. Families believed that maintaining order was more important than confronting reality. And in many cases, they were praised for it. I understand that now, intellectually. But understanding doesn't erase the impact. There's a strange loneliness that comes with discovering a shared past you were never allowed to access. It feels like arriving late to a conversation that ended years ago. Everyone else moved on, carrying the knowledge quietly, while you built a life without it. When the truth finally surfaces, you're left holding questions that no one else is asking anymore. I found myself wondering how often this happens to people. How many lives are shaped by decisions made in silence, justified by love and fear in equal measure? How many people sense that something is missing, but never have the chance to name it? The secret didn't just change how I saw my family, it changed how I saw memory itself. Memory isn't just what we remember, it's also what we're never told. Once I recognized the secret for what it was, everything felt different. Not immediately, but steadily, the past rearranged itself. Moments that once felt confusing suddenly became clear. The emotional distance I had always felt wasn't imagined, it was intentional. Not malicious, but intentional. And that distinction matters, even if it doesn't soften the reality. What stayed with me most was the realization that silence can be inherited, just like stories can. Families pass down behaviors, instincts, and fears without ever explaining their origins. By the time you notice them, they feel like your own. I carried that silence forward without knowing where it came from. I became careful in my own way, reserved in conversations, hesitant to ask questions. I learned from example, not explanation. There's no single moment when the secret was revealed to me. It unfolded gradually, piece by piece, until denial was no longer possible. And once that threshold was crossed, I couldn't go back to the version of myself who didn't know. Knowing changes the way you listen. It changes the way you remember. It changes the way you see yourself in the story you thought you understood. What makes this part of my life so difficult to explain is that nothing about it was dramatic on the surface. No confrontations, no confessions, just the slow realization that my life had been edited for me, carefully, lovingly, and without my consent. That realization didn't bring closure. It brought awareness, and awareness has a way of opening doors you didn't even know were closed. If this resonates with you, if you've ever felt like the last person to understand something about your own life, I'd like to hear from you. At the end, leave a comment with a phrase like "everyone knew," "family secret," or simply "this feels real." Those words matter. They remind me that these hidden stories don't exist in isolation and that silence, once recognized, doesn't have to stay unspoken. It's strange how an entire life can pivot on something so small. Not a dramatic confession, not a long-guarded family meeting, but a single clue that surfaces quietly, almost by accident, decades after it could have made a difference. In my case, it didn't announce itself as important. It appeared the way forgotten things often do in old age, tucked away, overlooked, waiting patiently while the years passed. I was sorting through things I had no real reason to sort through anymore. Drawers that hadn't been opened in years. Boxers moved from house to house, always labeled miscellaneous, always postponed for another day. At my age, you start doing that more often. You don't call it nostalgia, you call it organizing. But deep down, it's about understanding what remains. My hands weren't as steady as they used to be. And I remember thinking how ironic it felt that something so fragile had survived longer than my certainty about my own life. Papers yellowed with time. Old envelopes. Photographs with curled edges. Objects that once mattered enough to keep, but not enough to revisit. I wasn't looking for answers. That's the truth. I didn't believe answers were still possible. Then, I found it. At first, it meant nothing. Just another item mixed in with the rest, unremarkable, easy to dismiss. I almost put it back where it was, and if I had, I don't know how much longer the truth would have stayed buried. Maybe forever. But something about it made me pause. A detail that didn't align with what I remembered. A name that felt familiar but out of place. A date that didn't match the story I had carried for most of my life. That pause changed everything. I sat down because suddenly standing felt difficult. I read it again, slower this time, letting each word settle instead of rushing past it. That's when the discomfort began. Not panic, not shock, discomfort. The kind that creeps in when something doesn't fit, when your mind tries to force reality back into the shape it's always been, and fails. The clue didn't explain everything. It didn't spell out the truth in plain language. It wasn't generous like that. It simply contradicted the version of events I had always accepted. And that contradiction was enough. Enough to reopen questions I thought I had outgrown. Enough to make the silence of the past suddenly feel intentional instead of accidental. I remember thinking, why now? Why after all these years? Why when most of the people who could explain it were no longer here? That's one of the cruelest parts of discovering something late in life. Time becomes an obstacle instead of an ally. You don't have the luxury of confrontation. You only have interpretation. As I sat there, holding that single clue, memories began to surface without invitation. Moments from the 1970s resurfaced with sharper edges. Conversations that once felt vague now felt evasive. Decisions that once seemed reasonable now felt calculated. It was as if that small piece of evidence had flipped a switch, illuminating parts of my past that had always been there, just hidden in shadow. I realized how carefully my life had been arranged around this missing truth. Not with cruelty, but with precision. The clue wasn't an accident. It was a remnant. Something that slipped through the cracks when everything else was controlled. And the fact that it survived told me something important. The truth has a way of leaving fingerprints, even when people try to wipe them away. I didn't rush to tell anyone. I didn't even fully trust myself at first. I wondered if I was misreading it, projecting meaning where there was none. That's another thing age does to you. It makes you doubt your own perception. So I sat with it. I let the discomfort grow instead of pushing it away like I had done my entire life. Over the following days, I looked at other things differently. Old photos? Letters I had read 100 times without really seeing. I noticed patterns I had missed before. Names repeated in unexpected places. Timelines that didn't quite line up. The single clue became a key, not because it answered questions, but because it showed me which questions were worth asking. What struck me most was how ordinary the truth looked once it started to emerge. No grand conspiracy, no villain. Just people making choices in the 1970s based on fear, social pressure, and the belief that silence was safer than honesty. They didn't expect the future to circle back. They didn't imagine someone like me, decades later, sitting alone with fragile hands and too much time to think. I felt a mix of emotions I still struggle to name. Sadness, yes. Confusion. A strange sense of validation. Because that feeling I had carried for so long, that something about my life didn't quite add up finally, had context. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't ungrateful. I wasn't broken. I had been missing information. The clue didn't give me peace, not yet. What it gave me was direction. It pointed me toward a truth that had been quietly waiting for acknowledgement. And once you know where to look, you can't stop seeing signs everywhere. The past becomes louder. The silence starts to speak. At my age, you don't chase closure the way younger people do. You chase understanding, and that single clue, found decades later than it should have been, offered me that chance. Not to change the past, but to finally understand the forces that shaped it. If you're listening to this and something about it feels familiar, I want you to remember this moment. Because sometimes all it takes is one overlooked detail to rewrite everything you thought you knew. And if you've ever stumbled across something small that made you question a big part of your life, leave a comment at the end with a word like clue, letter, or too late. Those words tell me this story isn't just about my past, it's about how many truths are still waiting to be noticed. Once that realization settled in, there was no dramatic collapse, no moment where everything shattered at once. Instead, it felt like standing inside a familiar house and slowly noticing that the walls were not where I had always believed they were. The structure was still there. The memories were still real, but the foundation beneath them was different. And that difference changed how everything felt. I began to understand that my life hadn't been built on lies exactly, but on a carefully edited version of the truth. And that distinction mattered more than I ever expected it to. I started revisiting my past with a new kind of attention, the kind you only develop when time feels limited and clarity feels urgent. Events I had accepted without question now felt charged with meaning. Choices I once believed were purely mine appeared shaped by circumstances I had never been allowed to see. It was unsettling to realize how easily a person can adapt to a path without knowing who set it in motion. I didn't feel foolish. I felt human. Because when you're given a story early enough, you don't question its edges, you build your life inside it. The truth I was beginning to understand didn't erase my memories, but it reframed them. I saw how much of my identity had been constructed around assumptions rather than facts. I had believed I understood my origins, my place, my role in the family narrative. But now I could see how much had been decided before I ever had a voice. That awareness didn't come with anger right away. It came with disorientation. A quiet, persistent sense that I had been walking through my own life with incomplete directions. What troubled me most was not what had happened, but how naturally I had accepted it. I had trusted the process. I had trusted the people who told me what I needed to know and nothing more. And because of that trust, I never imagined that my understanding of myself was provisional. I thought identity was fixed, earned through time and consistency. I didn't realize how much of it depended on information I never received. As this understanding deepened, I noticed a strange shift in how I related to my memories. Some felt closer, sharper, almost demanding attention. Others felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. I began to see patterns where I once saw randomness. Why certain topics made me uneasy. Why certain decisions felt inevitable instead of chosen. Why I had always felt slightly misaligned, even during moments of success or stability. That feeling wasn't imagination. It was intuition reacting to absence. There's a particular weight that comes with realizing your life was shaped by truths you didn't know. It's not regret in the traditional sense. I don't wish I could redo everything. I don't believe that knowledge would have magically fixed my life, but I do wish I had understood the context of my choices. Understanding doesn't change the past, but it changes how you carry it. And carrying it differently matters, especially at this stage of life. I thought often about the 1970s during this time, about how normal everything felt then. How little I suspected that anything beneath the surface was influencing my direction. That decade became less about cultural change and more about personal redirection. Quiet decisions made in private had echoed outward for years. And I had lived inside those echoes without knowing their source. As I sat with this realization, I noticed how my sense of self began to loosen, not disappear, but soften. I stopped clinging so tightly to the version of myself I had always defended. I allowed room for complexity, for contradiction, for the possibility that I could be both authentic and misinformed at the same time. That realization brought an unexpected sense of relief. Because if my life had been built on a different truth, then my confusion all those years had a reason. I wasn't failing to understand myself. I was working with missing pieces. The past doesn't announce when it's about to change. It waits until you're ready to see it differently. And once you do, it doesn't let you go back to the simpler version. I found myself thinking less about blame and more about impact. About how silence, even when motivated by love, shapes lives in ways that can't be undone. About how entire identities can form around what is never said. There were moments when I felt grief for a version of myself that never had the full picture. Not because that version was wrong, but because it deserved honesty. I thought about the younger me, making decisions with confidence, unaware of the forces narrowing the field. I didn't feel anger toward that person. I felt compassion. Because we all do the best we can with what we know. Understanding that my life was built on a different truth didn't make me feel lost. It made me feel awake. Awake in a way that only comes when illusion fades and reality, however complicated, steps forward. I wasn't rewriting my story. I was finally reading the parts that had been left out. And as this awareness settled in, I realized it wasn't finished revealing itself. One truth leads to another. One realization opens the door to questions you didn't know how to ask before. This wasn't the end of understanding. It was the beginning of a deeper reckoning with how and why things unfolded the way they did. If you've been listening and any part of this feels uncomfortably familiar, I want you to remember that feeling. And at the very end, if you feel inclined, leave a comment with a phrase like, missing pieces, different truth, or this makes sense now. Those words help me understand how many lives have been quietly shaped by stories that were never fully told. Understanding why they hid it back then took longer than uncovering the truth itself. At first, my mind wanted simple answers. Fear, shame, control. Those words are easy to reach. For when you're trying to make sense of silence. But as I sat with it longer, I realized the reasons were more layered, more human, and far more tied to the time they lived in than to any single decision they made about me. You have to remember what America felt like in those years. Not the version we talk about now, but the version people actually lived inside. Reputation mattered more than emotional honesty. Family image was a form of currency. Being normal wasn't just preferred, it was protective. Anything that threatened that image was treated like a risk that had to be managed quietly, carefully, and without outside involvement. People believed that once something was spoken out loud, it became real in a dangerous way. They didn't grow up with language for emotional transparency. They didn't have models for difficult conversations. What they had were rules passed down through generations that said survival depended on discretion. You didn't air family matters. You didn't complicate a child's life with adult truths. You didn't challenge the structure that kept food on the table and judgment at bay. And most importantly, you didn't question authority inside the family, because authority was how order was maintained. When I look back now, I can see how quickly fear disguised itself as responsibility. They told themselves they were protecting me, protecting my future, protecting my ability to belong. And in their minds, belonging meant safety. It meant opportunity. It meant a life without unnecessary hardship. They believed that knowledge could be a burden, that truth could derail a person before they were strong enough to carry it. So they chose silence, convinced it was the kinder option. The 1970s amplified that mindset. The country was already unstable. Trust in institutions was eroding. Social norms were shifting in ways that frightened people who valued predictability. In that environment, holding on to control inside the family became even more important. If the outside world felt uncertain, the home had to feel solid, even if that solidity was built on omission. They believed that revealing the truth would invite chaos into a space that was supposed to be safe. I don't think they imagined the long-term consequences. They were focused on immediate stability, not future reckoning. They didn't picture an 88-year-old version of me sitting alone, piecing together fragments and wondering how different things might have felt with context. They were thinking about getting through the next year, the next conversation, the next moment, without disruption. That's how silence becomes permanent. It's chosen one day at a time until it no longer feels like a choice. There's also something else that took me time to admit. Hiding the truth wasn't just about protecting me. It was about protecting themselves from judgment, from guilt, from having to explain decisions made under pressure. Once a secret is acknowledged, responsibility follows. And responsibility can be heavy when you're already carrying the weight of survival, expectations, and social rules that leave little room for vulnerability. They lived in a culture where mistakes weren't processed, they were buried, where emotional discomfort was seen as weakness, where admitting uncertainty could unravel authority. So instead of saying we didn't know what to do, they chose to act certain. Instead of saying this is complicated, they simplified my story. And once that simplified version was established, it became easier to maintain than to undo. As I thought about this more deeply, I realized how much generational fear played a role. They had lived through scarcity, instability, and judgment in ways I never fully understood as a child. Their instinct was to control outcomes, to minimize risk, to keep everything appearing steady. Truth was unpredictable. Silence was manageable. And in their world, manageability often won. This doesn't absolve the impact. Understanding the reasons doesn't erase the consequences, but it does shift the way I carry them. I don't see monsters where there were just frightened people doing what they believed was necessary. That doesn't mean it was right. It means it was human. And humanity is rarely clean or clear when filtered through fear. What strikes me now is how normalized this kind of hiding was. It wasn't seen as deception, it was seen as discretion. It was reinforced by neighbors, extended family, even institutions that valued conformity over honesty. Silence wasn't questioned, it was respected. And once something becomes respectable, it's very hard to challenge it from the inside. I also see how this pattern repeats itself across families and generations. Secrets justified by love, omissions framed as protection, stories shaped to fit social expectations rather than personal truth. Many people live entire lives inside those edited narratives without ever realizing it. And sometimes the realization comes too late for dialogue, but not too late for understanding. As this awareness settled in, it didn't close the chapter for me. It opened another one. Because knowing why they hid it back then led me to a deeper question about what silence does over time, how it reshapes identity, and how long its effects can last when truth is delayed rather than denied outright. If you're still with me here, and this explanation resonates more than you expected, hold on to that feeling. And when this part ends, if you feel comfortable, leave a comment with words like "they thought they were protecting me, different times," or "now I understand." Those phrases tell me you're not just hearing this story, you're recognizing something familiar within your own learning. The truth at 88 years old feels nothing like people imagine. It isn't dramatic in the way movies portray late-life revelations. There's no sudden collapse, no screaming realization, no rush to confront the past. Instead, it arrives quietly, settling into you the same way age itself does, slowly, undeniably, and without asking permission. By the time you reach this stage of life, you're no longer chasing answers to change outcomes. You're searching for understanding, because understanding is the only thing that still rearranges the way the past sits inside you. At 88, time feels different in your body and in your thoughts. You don't experience it as something you own. You experience it as something that has already passed through you. Days move gently, but memories move fast. Entire decades can surface in a single afternoon, triggered by a sound, a smell, a sentence you didn't expect to hear. So when the truth finally revealed itself to me, it didn't feel late in the way people usually mean. It felt inevitable, like something that had been waiting until I was finally quiet enough to hear it. There's a strange clarity that comes with age. The noise of ambition fades. The pressure to prove yourself disappears. You stop explaining your choices to imaginary judges. That silence creates space, and in that space, truth becomes harder to ignore. At 88, you don't have the energy to protect illusions anymore. You don't want to. The mind becomes less interested in comfort and more interested in coherence. Things need to make sense before the story ends. What surprised me most was how the truth didn't rewrite my life, reweighted it. Moments I once thought were small suddenly felt significant. Decisions that felt inevitable revealed hidden influences. Emotions I once dismissed as weakness now felt like quiet intelligence trying to speak. Learning the truth at this age didn't give me new years, it gave me new context, and context changes everything. There's also grief in this kind of realization, but it's not the sharp grief of loss. It's a softer, heavier grief for the version of yourself who lived without full information. I thought about the younger me often. The one making choices with confidence, believing the ground beneath them was solid. I don't blame that person. I feel tenderness toward them because they trusted, and trust, in that time, was considered a virtue. At 88, you begin to understand that life is less about right and wrong, and more about known and unknown. I wasn't wrong about who I was incomplete. And there's an important difference there. That understanding brought an unexpected peace. I no longer felt the need to judge my past decisions harshly. How could I, knowing now what I didn't know then? The truth also changed how I see aging itself. People assume aging is about decline, loss of strength, loss of relevance, but learning something this profound so late in life showed me that aging is also about revelation, about finally being ready for complexity. Younger versions of us often don't have the emotional language or patience to sit with uncomfortable truths. At 88, discomfort doesn't scare me anymore. Confusion doesn't feel like failure. It feels like part of the process. There's a loneliness to learning the truth this late, though. Many of the people connected to it are gone. Conversations that should have happened decades ago now exist only in imagination. You don't get explanations, apologies, or confirmations. You get silence. And you have to make peace with that silence on your own. That's one of the hardest parts, realizing that understanding doesn't always come with closure. But there's also a quiet dignity in carrying the truth alone. It forces you to rely on your own interpretation, your own emotional honesty. At 88, you stop looking outward for validation. You trust your inner compass more than ever. And when the truth aligns with feelings you've carried for a lifetime, there's a sense of internal confirmation that doesn't require anyone else's agreement. I noticed that learning the truth softened me rather than hardened me. I became less judgmental of others' choices, more aware of how fear shapes behavior. I saw how easily people confuse protection with control, love with silence. And instead of anger, I felt understanding, not approval. Understanding that distinction matters. What it means to learn the truth at 88 is realizing that your life isn't over just because the future is shorter. The inner life keeps evolving. Meaning continues to shift. Identity remains flexible, even now. I didn't lose myself when the truth arrived. I expanded. I became more complete, even if that completeness arrived late. There's also urgency in this awareness, not panic, but intention. You start thinking about what needs to be said, what needs to be acknowledged, what shouldn't remain hidden anymore. Not for revenge, not for drama, but because silence no longer feels responsible. It feels heavy. And at this age, you're careful about what you choose to carry. I've come to believe that some truths wait for the right moment, not the right time. And for me, that moment came at 88, when I finally had the stillness, the maturity, and the emotional range to receive it without being destroyed by it. Earlier in life, this truth might have shattered me. Now, it reshapes me. If you're listening to this and wondering whether it's ever too late to understand your own story, I want you to sit with that question. And when this part ends, if you feel compelled, leave a comment with a word or phrase like "never too late," "clarity at last," or simply "I'm still learning." Those words matter more than you know. There is one thing I want you to carry with you as you listen to this, one idea that has stayed with me more strongly than any detail, any date, any explanation I uncovered along the way. It's not a lesson in the traditional sense, and it's not advice wrapped up neatly with a bow. It's something quieter. Something that only becomes visible when you've lived long enough to look back without needing to defend the past. What I want you to remember is this: a life can be honest and incomplete at the same time. For most of my years, I believed that if you lived decently, worked hard, stayed loyal, and followed the rules you were given, your story would make sense on its own. I believed meaning was automatic. That time itself would smooth out confusion. That unanswered questions would eventually stop mattering. But that isn't how it works. Time doesn't erase questions. It simply teaches you which ones are willing to wait. I want you to remember that silence is powerful, not just the loud, obvious kind, but the polite silence, the well-intentioned silence, the kind that's passed down gently and never announced as harmful. Silence shapes identity. It shapes choices. It shapes how people understand themselves without ever leaving fingerprints. And because it's quiet, it's often mistaken for peace. For decades, I thought peace meant not asking. I thought maturity meant acceptance without curiosity. I thought strength meant carrying confusion quietly and calling it resilience. And in the world I grew up in, that belief was reinforced at every turn. Families didn't sit around discussing emotional truth. They managed appearances. They protected narratives. They believed love meant shielding, not explaining. What I want you to remember is that understanding doesn't always arrive when it's most useful. Sometimes it arrives when it's most honest. And that distinction matters. If I had learned the truth earlier in life, I might have fought it, resisted it, or reshaped myself around it in ways driven by fear. Learning it now, at 88, I was finally able to receive it without needing it to fix anything. I only needed it to make sense. I want you to remember that confusion is not failure. Feeling out of place, sensing that something doesn't quite align. Noticing emotional gaps, you can't explain. Those aren't weaknesses, they're signals. And just because you don't have language for them yet, doesn't mean they're wrong. Many of us spend years dismissing our own intuition because it doesn't come with proof. But intuition is often the first thing to recognize missing truth. Another thing I hope you remember is this: people can love you deeply and still make choices that limit you. Love does not automatically mean clarity. Love, when filtered through fear and social pressure, can become controlling without intending to. That doesn't make the love fake, it makes it human. But recognizing that difference can free you from carrying misplaced guilt or self-blame. I also want you to remember that identity is more flexible than we're taught to believe. We grow up thinking we are finished products by a certain age, that once we settle into adulthood, our story is locked in place. But even now, even at 88, I've learned that understanding continues to evolve, meaning continues to shift. You don't stop becoming just because the future is shorter than the past. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that it's never wrong to want context. Wanting to understand your own life more fully isn't betrayal, it isn't disrespect, it isn't ingratitude, it's a form of and no matter what generation you come from, that desire is valid. I want you to remember that not every truth comes with confrontation. Some truths are meant to be integrated quietly, reflected on slowly, and carried forward with care. Closure isn't always a conversation. Sometimes it's an internal alignment, a feeling that the pieces finally sit where they belong. As I share this, I'm not asking you to question your family or reopen wounds or search for secrets that may not exist. I'm simply asking you to listen to yourself more closely, to notice the questions you've learned to avoid, to honor the moments that don't quite fit the story you've been telling yourself. Those moments matter more than we realize. And if any part of this stays with you after this section ends, if it lingers in a quiet way, I want to hear from you. At the very end, leave a comment with a phrase like this: "Stayed with me," "Silence matters," or "I'll remember this." You can even just write "listening." Those words tell me you're not just hearing this story, you're carrying it with you. If you stayed with me all the way to the end of this story, I want to thank you for giving your time and your attention. That means more than you might realize. If this kind of deep, reflective storytelling matters to you, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Subscribing helps keep these stories alive and tells the platform that thoughtful, human narratives still belong here. If you made it to the end, I'd love for you to leave a comment below. You can write something simple like "I stayed to the end," "listening until the last word," or even just "I'm still here." Those comments help this story reach others who may need it too. And if this story gave you something to think about, please tap the like button. That small action makes a big difference. Now, don't stop here. The next part of this journey is already on your screen. Click on the next video and continue with me, because there's still more to understand.